I do want to talk to you today about the incidence of psychotic disorders in rural communities. So those of you who know a bit about the epidemiology of psychotic disorders will know that predominantly the studies that we take our data from come from urban populations. And whether or not psychotic disorders show the same characteristics in rural environments is something really important to further understand the etiology of the disorders that we're looking at. So for that reason, I set up a study called the Social Epidemiology of Psychosis in East Anglia study. I'll shorten that to the sepia study for today's presentation. And I just want to give you some orientation as to the location we're talking about. So the study took part in the east of England. So if you look down here, it took part in these three counties. There are three counties here of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire. Cambridge is probably the most well-known of those. And these two maps here that you see show a few things. The first map shows that you've got, if you look at the bars, you can see the main densely populated towns. This is Cambridge, this is King's Lynn, I think. Then we've got Norwich up here and Ipswich down here. But it's a largely rural area with a few small market towns and cities. The colours here show levels of ethnic diversity. We see higher proportions of ethnic minority groups in our cities, but the rural areas predominantly characterised by quite low levels of ethnic diversity. And then on the second map, we see levels of deprivation. And you see in the south of the region quite an affluent area, but as we go further north and further east in this region, we've got areas with quite pronounced levels of deprivation. So it's a varied population, although it is mainly a rural one. It looks a bit like this. This is where I live. Actually, this is not true. I don't live here, but I do live in this town. This is Cambridge, of course, where I conducted this study and where I still live. And the region itself is quite rural and quite flat and boring. It was reclaimed, a lot of the land was reclaimed from the sea in a similar way to the Netherlands. In fact, it was done by Dutch engineers, and that's why we've got the presence of things like windmills around. This is an example of British Rail, just to give you an example of how we live. But the area is quite varied. We have quite a lot of industry in certain parts of the region, particularly on the coastline where there are large ports and docks. And the area does have this variation in things like socioeconomic deprivation. Cambridge is often seen as quite an affluent area, but parts of our region are quite deprived. This is a picture of a coastal town called Great Yarmouth, where there are a number of social and health issues that affect that area because of unemployment and the lack of industry and investment in those areas over recent years. So that's why we set up the study, the sepia study. There are several objectives. First, to simply estimate the incidence of first episode psychotic disorders in this diverse rural community. And then second, to see whether in a rural population, we find that rates vary by the same predictors that we see in urban areas. So do rates vary by age and sex? Do rates vary by ethnicity, migration, age at migration? And do rates vary by neighbourhood level social factors? Finally, we wanted to look at other characteristics of the types of people presenting to the early intervention in psychosis services that formed part of this research. And we've investigated both waiting times for access to treatment as well as reasons why people get discharged from our early intervention services. That third objective, I'm not going to talk about those results today. I'm going to focus on the incidence findings from the study. So as I've shown you, this is the study area. For a 3.5-year period, we identified anybody aged between 16 and 35 years old who came into contact with one of our 6 early intervention in psychosis services, EIP services. Now, it's important to know that in an English context, these are the only places where you can go as a young person for your first episode of psychosis. So they're very good points to monitor to try and capture the treated incidence of psychotic disorder in a young population. If you're referred from your GP or from other services, you will be referred eventually to an early intervention psychosis service who will provide you that treatment in the UK. So those 6 services provided the treatment contact points for us to ascertain all cases. Along with the age criteria, you had to be living within the catchment area of the study with the presence of psychotic symptoms, the absence of an organic basis to disorder, and if you'd been in contact with any service, not just within our region, but any service for a previous psychosis, you were excluded from the study. So the referral pathway was as follows, really. You were referred to the EIS team or EIP team. You could then be accepted by the team, and then we had to check that those people who were accepted met our inclusion criteria, and if they were meeting our epidemiological criteria, then we would collect sociodemographic information on them. Unlike the wonderful work in the Euro SC study, where there was a whole suite of information collected, we focused on a very few number of predictors that we thought would be relevant to this project. So we only collected data on very basic demographic information in this study, including ethnicity, where people lived at the time of presentation, and migration-related factors. We followed people up to see whether or not they had a psychotic disorder. So when you get accepted into an early intervention psychosis service, you would hope that most people at least had psychotic symptoms and probably had disorder in order to treat them. But we know that there's a lot of variability in the way people present, so we had to check that. And we first did that by just taking clinical diagnosis 6 months after acceptance and 3 years after acceptance. And then we validated those clinical diagnoses using a standardized approach. Because we were working across 6 sites in this region, we wanted to ensure that a clinician making a diagnosis of schizophrenia in Cambridge was making the same diagnosis as a clinician doing the same in another part of the region. So we used OPCRIT-based diagnosis. OPCRIT is a 90 symptom item checklist developed at the IOP in the 1980s to provide you with a reliable and valid way of ascertaining ICD-10 diagnoses, and we collected those at both 6 months and 3 years. If you were discharged from the service before your 3 years of compulsory treatment, then we would collect these diagnosis, clinical diagnosis and discharge diagnosis at the time of discharge, as well as the reason why people were discharged. To estimate incidence rates, we need to think a bit about the population from which they come from. So we need to estimate the population at risk. We simply did that from the 2011 census, which fell right in the middle of our 3.5-year follow-up case ascertainment period. Data were stratified by age, sex, ethnicity, age at migration, and small area neighborhoods. There were 530 what we call small area neighborhoods in this study, with a median population of about 4,000 people, so they're quite small, precise regions. And this is the results. You see that over those 3.5 years, we had 1,000 people referred to services for suspected psychosis, but about 100 of them were excluded because they were only deemed to be high risk, and at the time of these services, they weren't taking high-risk groups. We then checked the remainder to see if they had met our epidemiological criteria. We excluded another 100 people who had previously contacted services, were outside our age range, and so forth. We then had to check whether people had a clinical diagnosis of psychosis at any point during their follow-up, and that excluded another 60 or so participants. And finally, we had to validate those clinical diagnoses against OPCRIT diagnosis, and doing that led to the exclusion of some more patients, so that we ended up with a sample that we could confidently say were first episode cases of clinically diagnosed and validated psychotic disorder, including schizophrenia, other non-affective disorders, and affective psychoses. And that was our working incidence sample. And I'm going to focus today in the main on those who met entry criteria. In fact, I'm not going to focus on that group. You can just think about this group down here. I'm going to focus only on the incidence sample of 687 people. So actually, the age-sex distribution is quite classic. We see 2/3 of the sample being men compared to women, exactly what you would expect in any study. Interestingly, that before 35 years of age, men and women have exactly or roughly exactly the same onset or first age at referral. So for men, that was 22.5 years. For women, that was 23.4 years. But there's no statistically significant differences between those ages. So although we often think of women as having a slightly later onset of psychosis, if you only look in the group before 35 years of age, you'll actually find that men and women present around the same time. In terms of the ethnic composition of our case participants, about 25% of them came from ethnic minority backgrounds, mostly from actually from non-British white backgrounds, so white European migrants, particularly from Eastern Europe. A small sample of people then from mixed ethnicity and from African backgrounds. If we take that 25% and we look at where they came from, we find 109 of them were foreign-born, so about 60% of them are foreign-born, again, as you'd expect, mostly from Eastern Europe, as I just described, and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as elsewhere. So we've got variability in both first and second generation migrant status and in ethnicity. The overall incidence rate in the study was about 34 per 100,000, about in line with what we would expect for an incidence rate for any psychotic disorder, but rates were significantly higher for men than women, as we would expect, even after adjusting for confounders. But we see variation in that risk by age, and you'll see that for men there's this classic peak in risk, actually a bit earlier than we've seen in earlier samples, perhaps a result of early intervention. We see that the peak age risk for men is about 18 to 19 years old. For women, the highest incidence rates occur even younger in our 16 to 17-year-old group. So we're talking about a very early onset set of disorders here. As I showed you yesterday, for those of you who were able to come to my talk yesterday, compared to the white British group, we see elevated rates of psychotic disorders in a rural community amongst a number of ethnic minority groups. So this isn't just a phenomenon of populations living in urban areas. If you're an ethnic minority, if you're from an ethnic minority background living in a rural population, you're also likely to experience elevated rates of psychosis. As I showed you yesterday, these aren't accounted for by age, sex, and socioeconomic status. And in particular, just like elsewhere in the UK, it's the Black Caribbean and Black African populations who seem to be at greatest risk. Some of the new findings relate to age at migration, and for the first time in a UK context, we were able to understand and explore the role of age at migration on incidence of psychotic disorders. And this is the overall incidence of psychotic disorders for all ethnic minority groups born outside of the UK by the age at which they migrated. And you can see that for most ages at which they migrate, there's no significant difference compared to the white British group. But at one age group, between 5 and 12 years old, people show this significantly elevated risk of developing psychosis. When we separate out different ethnic groups, the findings are quite interesting. We see a more or less identical pattern for people from non-British white backgrounds, so from white European backgrounds where the data is available, we see a significant peak there. Very similar to the overall trend. For people from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds, we get a trend for this effect at 5 to 12 years old, and a significant risk amongst those who migrate from Pakistan and Bangladesh as adults. And then for the Black Caribbean and African groups, we see a similar trend. Although they're at higher risk at all ages of migration, that tends to peak again at this 5 to 12-year-old period when they migrated. Just simply for other groups, there's not much going on, but that other group is quite heterogeneous. But putting that all together, the most consistent pattern suggests that migrating in childhood between around the ages of 5 and 12, and we don't hold any specificity to those ages, those were what we had available from routine data, that you do see some elevation in risk across different ethnic groups at this age range. So what about geographical variation in incidence rates? What do we find? Well, I want to show you first comparisons at the level of the early intervention psychosis services that we were looking at. We had 6 of those, and they're shown in blue on the graph. And we've compared those rates to the rates from the classic ESOP study, which some of you might be familiar with in the UK. ESOP was conducted in South London, Nottingham and Bristol. And what you'll see is that nowhere gets close to the rates that we see in South London, around Camberwell, around the Maudsley. Those rates are really out on their own. But if you look at the pattern of results by early intervention centre in our study, they're quite similar and comparable to rates that we find in urban areas of the UK and cities called Nottingham and Bristol. And there's some variation here. This is this one here, Great Yarmouth, has significant, when you do the statistics, you see that this rate is significantly higher than virtually all of these rates when you've adjusted for other factors. And this is the area that I showed you earlier that has massive social problems on the east coast of England. We can drill down into that data a bit more, and I told you there were 530 neighbourhoods, and for those 530 neighbourhoods we were able to collect a lot of census information about the areas, and we've recently factor analysed that data to get 4 principal constructs of what those neighbourhoods were like, and related that to the incidence of psychotic disorders. You can read a bit more about this in this month's JAMA Psychiatry. And we've characterised those areas in terms of ethnic diversity. You'll see that our cities in the region are quite ethnically diverse, with some areas of the rural parts of this area having ethnic diversity as well. In terms of deprivation, there's variation, but some of our cities, not Cambridge, but cities like King's Lynn, Ipswich, quite deprived, as well as some rural parts of our region, as I mentioned earlier. Urbanicity, the the height of the bars correspond roughly to the colours of the bars, so we've got variation by urbanicity, and we've got variation by social isolation, our fourth factor. And social isolation exists both in our cities, where people tend to live alone to a greater extent, as well as in our rural communities. We wanted to see if these factors were related to the incidence of psychotic disorder across the region, and using multi-level modelling, we were able to show that for all psychotic disorders, 3 of those factors were independently significantly showing that they were associated with higher rates of psychosis. So areas with higher levels of deprivation, areas which were more urban, and areas which had greater levels of social isolation, even after adjusting for each other, still all showed elevated rates of psychosis, although no effect of ethnic diversity. Looking at that pattern for schizophrenia and other non-affective psychotic disorders, we see a little bit of difference. We now see a role for ethnic diversity. When people live in more ethnically diverse neighborhoods, we see a reduction in the risk of psychotic disorders or non-affective psychotic disorders, but there's still a role there for deprivation and for social isolation as well. Finally, for the affective psychotic disorders, we had quite a small sample, but we didn't see any effect for any of our main 4 variables that I've just described. We did look separately at 2 effects called ethnic density, which some of you will be familiar with the proportion of people from your own ethnic group living in your neighborhood, and ethnic fragmentation, the extent to which you live close to those people or you live further away from them. And for both of those measures, we see that there are lower levels of affective psychotic disorders in areas where you're living with more people from your own ethnic group around you. So some further evidence that the ethnic composition of your neighborhood seems to affect the incidence of psychotic disorders. In the last 2 minutes, I've just summarized the conclusions from this study. So we see variation in rates of psychotic disorders in rural areas, and this variation is actually quite similar to the variation we see in urban areas. We see the same findings playing out. That it doesn't matter if you live in a rural or urban area. If you live in a deprived community, you're more likely to experience a higher rate of or risk of developing psychotic disorders. If you're from an ethnic minority background, your risk still goes up in those rural areas. That environmental risk suggests to me that being exposed to adverse social experiences, wherever you are in a rural-urban environment, seems to increase your risk. But it might be that in urban environments you're constantly exposed to those to a greater extent, which then leads to the higher rates of psychotic disorders we see in our urban communities. From a clinical perspective, it's interesting to note that before 35 years of age, the age at first referral for men and women is quite similar, and that might change the way we think about classic epidemiology in psychotic disorders and think about who's presenting to our early intervention psychosis services and to other services where we treat young people. Finally, I think one of the new things that this study has shown or raises the possibility for is that the migration effect, the increased risk that I talked about yesterday amongst migrants, might be conditional on certain times in our life when it's better or worse to migrate. And in this study, we showed that childhood migration seemed to be particularly associated with increased risk. Perhaps that's due to key parts of neurodevelopment happening at that age, including learning language development the first time, the development of social cognition, where you're just beginning to make those social contacts and social networks in the world that then allow you to go on and function in society. If that's disrupted significantly by a change in your language or a change in the people around you, perhaps that starts to have deleterious effects on your risk of developing psychotic phenomena later on. You're not meant to read this, it's just to let you know that we've now published 8 publications from the CPS study. We've got 1 or 2 more hopefully in the pipeline, and hopefully this will inspire you to go and have a read of some of those in more detail. I need to thank the huge number of people who took part in the CPS study, both the participants and all the clinics involved and all the psychiatrists, care coordinators who spent hours of their time for free doing this work. In particular, my research group as well, I need to acknowledge, who have done a large amount of this work. So thank you to them. Thank you to you for your attention. And please, if you'd like to learn more, get in touch. Thank you.